You can't put on the helmet after the accident. You have to put on the helmet before the accident. And asset protection is the same.
Too many entrepreneurs that we see come to us and they have no asset protection plan. They're completely exposed. Their life's work from a business and even maybe personal wealth is just out there susceptible to creditors and predators.
But today the insurance companies are saying, oh no, we're looking at you. And so we have to be careful and make sure we're good risks for the insurance companies.
Insurance costs have been rising rapidly because the construction or the rebuild cost has gone up on a price per square foot basis, but also the natural disaster probabilities have gone through the roof.
Don't think just because these people are like family to you that you can't get in a situation where you end up getting in an EPLI problem, and you want to make sure you have those coverages.
All right, Jim, the book club continues. We're in chapter 4. We're going to deep dive into asset protection here.
I thought this was chapter 3.
This is chapter 3. We're going to deep dive into asset protection here.
Okay, sounds good.
I'm not great at counting.
That's all right. You are good at counting. Maybe you're not good at reading.
Yeah, there you go. That's true. I actually am more of a podcast guy. It's more efficient because I can't read at 1.8x speed, but I can listen at 1.8x speed.
You can. You're good at listening fast.
Yeah, I'm maybe not reading fast, but I'm good at listening fast. Yeah. All right, so asset protection. I love the way that this chapter opens up. You've got a really, honestly, kind of an emotional, tough story that we open up this chapter with, some stuff that you remember from your childhood about putting your helmet on, and risk management. So maybe kick us off with that story and how you like to frame up risk management and asset protection.
There was a kid I went to high school with. He was a really good baseball player, popular kid. And the summer after his senior year, his family would routinely go down to Rocky Point. I grew up in Tucson, Arizona. We'd go down to Rocky Point. By the way, if you have property in Rocky Point, this was a whole different thing. This was people camped out in tents. There were no resorts down there. And they would go down there in ATV. Well, one day, this young man was off ATVing the summer after his senior year and didn't come back. And they went looking for him. A few hours later, his brother found him. He had crashed on his ATV and bled to death. And had he been wearing a helmet, in those days no one wore helmets for stuff like that. Had he been wearing a helmet, he probably would have walked away. Instead, it was a terrible tragedy for the family. And I remember it was one of the first encounters I had with death because I knew the kid, that kid was no longer around because of this accident. And I always think back to that day. If that family could have done anything, they would have had him put on a helmet before he went riding that day. The problem, though, with that type of accident is you can't put on the helmet after the accident. You have to put on the helmet before the accident. And asset protection is the same. You have to do your asset protection before you have a problem. You can't do it very well after you have a problem.
Yeah, and too many times even we'll see entrepreneurs that unfortunately are involved in litigation, and then after they get the subpoena or after they get the notice of the lawsuit, they're served, what can I do, right? And then you got fraudulent conveyance. There's a lot of things get ramped up if you try to get cute and play some games after the fact. So using the same metaphor of putting your helmet on, you got to make sure all of your asset protection is buttoned up ahead of time, and hence, that's the whole definition of it. But too many entrepreneurs that we see come to us and they have no asset protection plan. They're completely exposed. Their life's work from a business and even maybe personal wealth is just out there susceptible to creditors and predators.
Yeah, and a lot of entrepreneurs don't know that if they think, well, I don't really have any assets yet. If you're making money, you can still get a judgment and they'll garnish your wages, and they can do that for decades depending on what went wrong. So make sure that even if you don't have assets yet, obviously if you have assets, but if you don't have assets yet and you're making good income, you should have really solid asset protection.
Yep. So the way we're going to frame up this chapter, I like to use the metaphor of building a castle. So if we can all envision a castle, there's different layers of defense, and that's how we like to instruct and guide our entrepreneur clients through asset protection. So the first layer of defense in a castle is going to be the moat. So for us here, this is going to be just strategic legal protections that are built into the laws, right? So unless you technically violate a law, technically, you shouldn't be getting sued, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is going to be the walls of the castle. That's like really your first true line of defense. The analogy there is going to be your insurance. So if you're getting attacked in the castle, hopefully the insurance or the walls will repel any intruder. The third line of defense is going to be that drawbridge. And so the drawbridge is there that, again, solidified, not allowing any intruders in. This is going to be the entity structure. So you want to make sure you have that drawbridge closed, which is really proper entity design so people can't pierce the corporate veil. And then the last kind of layer there in your wealth castle is going to be the hidden vaults. This is what we would consider.
What about the castle walls?
Castle walls was number 2.
Oh, okay.
Insurance.
I jumped ahead. Sorry about that.
Yeah, so I already talked about the castle walls. I'm better at listening. You're better at reading.
Yeah, that's good.
But number 4 is as the hidden vaults. Think of this as hidden vaults, hidden crevices, hidden spaces within the castle. The metaphor there is going to be asset protection trust. So even if someone has broached the moat, overcome the walls, barged in the drawbridge, they now need to go find these hidden vaults in order to truly come after all of your assets. So with that frame up, let's start with the moat, which is going to be just laws that are built in, inherent for every entrepreneur, just a few little things that they should be taking advantage of. What are a few of your favorites here?
Yeah, well, homestead exemption, you always need to know that. And if you take states like Texas and Florida that have unlimited homestead protection, that's powerful if you own an expensive home there. Very limited in states like California. So know what yours is, because that can impact how you handle your home, whether you want to have it titled in different ways. So homestead exemption is one of my favorite. And then also ERISA laws. ERISA laws are very powerful. Those are things like 401ks. IRAs are state laws, so you need to know what those are as well. But ERISA is incredibly tough for someone to pierce if they're suing you. And a good example is O.J. Simpson. He allegedly killed someone in criminal court. He actually killed someone in civil court. Those were the judgments. And yet the judgment that the families had against him was in the $60-70 million range and kept growing and growing and growing. They could never get any of the money because all his money was in ERISA plans, NFL pension, NFL 401k. And as long as he spent the money that came out, they couldn't get to any of that money. So it shows how strong ERISA laws are. And sometimes I meet entrepreneurs that they say, I don't want any money in any qualified plans. I don't want any money in my 401k. And I take the attitude is, you don't want all of your money in a 401k. That would make no sense. But I like some of my money in there because it's super protected from an asset protection perspective, and that matters.
Yeah. So great job explaining the moat, first line of defense. Take advantage of these different protected asset classes, the homestead, the different laws, the rules and regulations of the road. As long as you're staying within those rules and regulations, technically you shouldn't be getting sued and you shouldn't have any exposure, right? Same thing to be said with your business. If you are selling products that are above the law, everything is good, buttoned up, your copy isn't, too aggressive to the FTC, et cetera, you shouldn't have any issues. So that's the first thing. But we do live in a litigious society. Yep. So oftentimes, even if you're buttoned up, there could be a lawsuit. And that's where the castle walls come into play. And the story here that we use in the book is from going back to my agriculture upbringing, really my dad's side of the family. A lot of when he was growing crops was alfalfa, and as alfalfa hay. And the process of alfalfa hay, it's very particular in that here in Arizona, you can harvest around 9 to 10 times per year. But when you go in and cut the alfalfa hay, you first cut it and you have to make sure you have the right dew point out, the right humidity, because you want to make sure it doesn't rot before you bale it. So you cut it, it lays out in the field, and then usually it's in the middle of the night when the humidity is down. You'll then rake it into piles, and then from the piles that are raked, you then start baling it. The problem is that if your hay gets rained on when it's out in the field or when it's raked, it ruins the entire crop. And so that's where insurance is very important, because if you only have 9 or 10 cuttings for the entire year, think of that as you have 9 or 10 opportunities to make revenue for the entire year. And there's seasonality, there's different yields in the different cuttings. But if you're maybe the hay's laying out there for 2 to 3 days per cutting, think of that now if it rains on one of those days, you could instantly lose 10 to 20% of your entire revenue for the entire year. So that's where the insurance comes into play of like you said in the beginning, put your helmet on ahead of the accident. So then if you're a farmer in this example, do you need to insure that? Or do you want to self-insure? What does that look like? And again, you got to buy the insurance before it rains, so to speak.
You think you miss your calling, agriculture?
I don't think so. I think it's very fascinating, but I don't think that it's right for me because I'd have to live way out. These farmlands out in Yuma, and I've got a comfortable setup here.
Yeah, well, my grandpa was a farmer long time ago. He was born in 1882. My mom's dad, he was a farmer in Ohio for a long time, and none of the kids stayed on the farm. Yeah, it's a tough business.
It's a tough way of life. So as we then talk through insurance for entrepreneurs, let's start with the personal P&C. Jim, let's get you to start us off of what are some of the big things entrepreneurs need to be considering when they're looking at their personal insurance policies.
Yeah, so one thing you want to look at is you have these 3 numbers you've probably heard before, and they might be 25, 50, 20, 250, 500, and 100 might be those numbers. And that means 250,000, 500,000, 100,000. Those numbers mean 250 is the amount that are covered for any one person in any one incident. 500,000 would be the liability covered for all people involved in one incident. And then 100,000 would be property damage. And to think about those numbers, if you're out driving around, you get distracted, you're checking your phone, something that I know no one on this listening to this podcast ever does. But if you do, you blow through a stop sign or a yield sign and you hit somebody and someone gets injured, you're probably going to get sued, especially if they're injured badly. And if you get cited, that's coming your way. And in today's environment, if that person got hurt and they were a high income earner and they couldn't work the rest of their life, that could be a huge number that you get sued for. And in that case, you're covered under 250,000, any one person in one incident. And the insurance company could very easily just go, you know what, we'll just write a check for the 250 and you're on your own. You got to find your own attorneys to defend you. And anything that you lose in a settlement, you're going to be responsible for personally. So instead of that, you want to make sure you have enough coverage in your liability on your auto, for example, and then put an umbrella over it. And that umbrella comes in chunks of $1 million. And you want to think about a couple of ways you could calculate that. One would be figure out what your net worth is and go to the next million. Simple way to do it. However, just like you said, there are some parts of your portfolio or parts of your assets that are protected. So if you have money in a 401k, that's protected. If you have homestead protection, that's protected. So you might look at what's exposed versus just net worth to come up with that number and round up that way. There's various ways you can do the calculation, but you want to have enough to where it's meaningful to the insurance company. And so that could be 1 million, 5 million, 10 million. I have a $10 million umbrella. I want to make sure that the insurance company is not writing a check and leaving me to the wolves, and that they're going to bring their attorneys and defend me. So that's one of the first things is umbrella liability.
And the umbrella policy goes over not only the auto, but also the home. And so on the home front, you want to make sure you got the right dwelling coverage, especially we've seen a lot of fires out in the west, the southwest, a lot of hurricanes out in the southeast. And so insurance costs have been rising rapidly because A, the construction or the rebuild cost has gone up on a price per square foot basis, but also the natural disaster probabilities have gone through the roof. So there's a lot of issues, I should say, when it comes to the dwelling costs and the insurance. You want to make sure we see a lot of our entrepreneurs that have very nice houses, but their insurance is not keeping up with the inflation of a rebuild cost. So if the house was burned down, perhaps the fair market value of the house is $5 million. Maybe the lot is worth $1.5 million. So that's $3.5 million of costs allocated to the building. But on a price per square foot, now with the market where it's at, maybe it costs $5 million of cash to rebuild that. The insurance company writes you a check for $3.5 million. They say, good luck, right? You're not going to be able to rebuild the exact same house with the nice features. So that's a big thing that we see on the personal or on the home front. Yeah,
you know, one other thing on the home insurance, because this is a big one, is you need to look through this. If you have a fractional family office, your people should be reviewing this, but read through your policies if you're doing this on your own, because there's so many exclusions you need to be concerned about. Just take umbrellas, for example. I've seen dangerous dog exclusions. I've seen watercraft exclusions. I've seen firearm exclusions where some insurance companies are excluding firearms. So if your teenager is over at the house and gets a gun of yours and accidentally shoots the kid's friend, no coverage. I mean, obviously you should secure your firearms, but looking for those exclusions is critically important, understanding those policies. And as a side note, I think we mentioned this in one of the past podcasts, but private equity is massively funding advertising for lawsuits, personal injury lawsuits, and they're partnering with attorneys in many states. In fact, Florida just passed a law to make it illegal for private equity to fund all this advertising. And if you're watching any TV, if you see any commercials, you'll notice this dramatic uptick in these advertisements for personal injury lawsuits. What that means is it's creating a lot more frivolous lawsuits and driving up the cost of your umbrella. If you haven't seen that, you're going to see that. In addition, it's going to create a situation where the insurance companies are not going to want to provide the umbrella. So it used to be that kind of we're in the driver's seat and we say, hey, insurance company, I'm going to shop you. I'm going to find out the one that, charges me the least for the best policy. But today the insurance companies are saying, oh no, we're looking at you. And so we have to be careful and make sure we're good risks for the insurance companies, because I was talking to a friend of mine who's a property and casualty agent, and he was telling me that, yeah, a couple of speeding tickets used to be no problem, can get a $5 million umbrella for you. Today, nope, you got 2 speeding tickets? No, go to a different carrier. So you want to be really careful on your driving record and on when you put a claim in. You don't want to put a claim in for your windshield being cracked or something minor. Save the claim for the really big event, because if you do too many little claims, you could get fired by your insurance company.
Yeah, crazy world. I do remember it's definitely changed in the last 3 years. I think I was thinking of Geico, save you 15% or more on your insurance there, and it used to just be a commodity.
Right.
But now the tides have turned, and we've got entrepreneurs that are clients that have the kids on the policies, right? There's a lot of different issues with speeding tickets, crashes, and then now they're really held hostage that they can't go anywhere else. No one will underwrite them. Premiums are going up 30 to 40% year over year, and there's nothing they can do.
Right.
Their back's in a corner.
Yeah.
Last thing I'll say here on the personal insurance front is really scheduled items. And so oftentimes we see entrepreneurs who maybe have the Rolexes, the watch collection, the diamond rings, the jewelry, but those aren't properly insured because oftentimes they assume that it's covered underneath the home policy. Well, if my home burns down, everything in my home gets replaced, right? Well, no, there's something called sublimits. And generally the sublimits for jewelry is going to be $2,500. And that's jewelry, watches, fine art, all of that's $2,500. There's a sublimit for cash because you can imagine, you could say, oh, I had $1 million of cash that just burned down. How about you pay me $1 million? So there's sublimits of cash also. So that's where if you're holding a lot of gold, silver, anything, cash, anything of value, you need to make sure that all that gets scheduled and listed, because even if it's in a fireproof safe, but that melts, that disappears, there's no coming back and getting that money because of the sublimits.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was at an event. I was talking to another entrepreneur, and this came up. I don't even know how this came up, but he had $1 million worth of watches stolen, and he didn't have them scheduled on his policy. So he was out $1 million, and they had cased the place. They had sprayed something on the camera so he had no camera footage. They actually got into his safe. I mean, these were professionals, but it was $1 million of watches, and none of them were scheduled. So he was out $1 million.
That's brutal. All right, let's transition over to business insurance. So we talked about protecting the personal side on the personal insurance. Now let's move to business or commercial insurance. Let's hit some of the big ones, the big categories here. The first is going to be general liability. So this is going to be really more of the slip and fall coverage. You're also going to have completed operations here for services, businesses. You're going to have product liability, personal and advertising. So that's going to be kind of your generic building block policy. And then if you're in the professional space,
can I just say one thing on that? And that is, in my first book, I told a story where there was 2 business owners. They started a business. They were in a little strip mall, and it was a virtual business. It was all internet stuff. And they didn't want to get a general liability policy, but their agent pushed them, and they decided, okay, they would get one. Well, it turns out they got sued for copyright infringement and false advertising, or what would you call that, advertising that would conflict with this big international huge company sued them, and they would have been just completely destroyed. Because of that policy, the insurance company fought it. They won that lawsuit, and then they went on to build a company and sell it. And I think it wasn't a huge sale, but they each walked away with about $10 million. That would have never happened if they didn't have the general liability, because they thought it was slip and fall. They didn't realize it would cover them for things like advertising and IP infringement.
Yeah, no, good point there. So for service-based businesses, whether you're a doctor, whether you're in any type of giving advice, that's where the professional liability, also called errors and omissions, comes into play. And this is going to be really if you provide bad advice, if you're sued, or if you're a doctor, you make a mistake, that's going to be malpractice underneath the same umbrella. So that's for really, again, if you look at the society today in the United States, the bulk of business owners are in a service-based business or in a service-based industry. That's predominantly what drives our GDP. So E&O, malpractice, and professional liability are very, very important for all of those.
Yeah. EPLI, Employment Practices Liability Insurance. More and more we're seeing employee lawsuits. Probably 20 years ago, I didn't see this that much in the entrepreneur space. I'm seeing a lot more of it now. And sometimes you hear entrepreneurs, I just have 3 employees and they're like family. I can tell you, when we had someone embezzle from us, we were a little family. It was like 3 employees. So don't think just because these people are like family to you that you can't get in a situation where you end up getting in an EPLI problem, and you want to make sure you have those coverages.
And I think the big thing with EPLI is understand what states you're operating in and where your exposure is. a comical example here, which is a real story, is one of our entrepreneurs was subject to a class action lawsuit because he failed to enforce bathroom breaks for his call center in California. So therefore, these employees claimed that they should be paid overtime. I think it was 30 minutes a day because 2 15-minute bathroom breaks were not enforced. And so therefore, they were owed overtime. He ended up settling, I think it was about $60,000. But again, California, you kind of make jokes about ambulance chasers or personal injury attorneys. In California, they're EPLI chasers because California is so lenient on protecting the employees at the detriment of the employers that oftentimes people are just looking for an angle to bring an EPLI case for, again, discrimination. It's going to be, sexual assault, abuse, anything that's in that realm is going to really be where EPLI comes into play.
And that's along the lines of, I remember talking to a friend who's a business owner in California, and he said they actually put a line item on the P&L to pay out for frivolous lawsuits because there are all these billboards and attorneys who are trying to get, if you lose your job for any reason, then you're going to have an attorney tell you should sue. And what they do is they just negotiate a settlement, and that's part of their P&L. That shows how bad it is in California.
Yeah. All right, next let's go into cyber. This is one of the most expensive areas we're in the age of AI and everything that's going on, the level of sophistication on cyber attacks. Even yesterday, our in-house IT, Caleb, he was posting about 3 different wealth management firms that all were subject to a phishing attack and all now had hundreds, if not thousands, of records stolen, socials, etc. And so cyber is, I remember being a niche cottage industry several years ago, and now it is actually extremely hard to actually get cyber policies. You need to have the firewalls, you need to have multi-factor authentication. If you don't have all of these different parameters set up on your existing systems, they won't even write you the policy because the payout claims are going exponential. Yeah,
I remember Caesars Entertainment a couple of years ago. They got hacked and they were checking people into the hotel with paper and pen. None of the, what do you call them, the one-armed bandits, none of the slot machines were working. The casino was mostly shut down, and it was costing them a huge amount of money every day. And they actually paid a ransom. I think it was like 30 or 40 million bucks. But if Caesars Entertainment can get hacked, anyone can get hacked. So you really, as an entrepreneur, you got to pay attention to that.
All right, let's talk through D&O. So, Jim, this is an oftentimes overlooked policy, director and officer policy. What are you looking for, and how should entrepreneurs understand if they need to buy a D&O policy?
The first thing is, if you're sitting on any board, whether it's a charity or anything else, you have risk. And usually charities, if it's a 501c3, is going to have some sort of D&O policy. Before you agree to be a board member, look at the D&O policy. You want to look at what it covers. You want to look at the coverage limits. And of course, if it's a charity that takes care of children, there's a higher risk there, right? Because if there's someone in the organization abusing a child, that's a much bigger risk than other types of organizations. So know what it is that you're getting into, the risk, look at the D&O policy, and then really decide, do you need that risk in your life? Is it something that matters that much? Because you can raise money for a charity, you can volunteer at a charity, you can do a lot of things other than sit on the board.
I think the other piece where D&O really comes into play is if you're a business owner and you're capital raising, so you're really taking on money from outside investors, whether it's seed capital or venture capital, different series, because that's where you've got obviously fiduciary duty to the business. But if they think there's been a misappropriation, the shareholders can sue you for breach of your fiduciary duty as a director and an officer to that company. So if you're bootstrapping your own business, D&O likely doesn't necessarily make sense. But in those other fact patterns you're talking about, D&O is an oftentimes overlooked coverage and policy there.
Yeah, most definitely.
Let's talk through commercial property insurance. So BOP policies, business operating, BOP policy, commercial insurance. So a few things that we're looking at here. This is, again, think if you are, as an example, a dentist, you want to make sure that all of your equipment, which is hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, is all appropriately insured. So that way, if there's any type of fire at your facility, then you can buy back the equipment. You can rebuild. Same thing if you're running a manufacturing building or a manufacturing business. All of the machinery, the equipment, all of that needs to be scheduled separately underneath the commercial property insurance. And then you really need to make sure you understand like replacement versus actual cash value, fair market value, what's happening with inflation and the cost of replacing this type of equipment. And then also you want to make sure you understand as part of this too, any liability that comes along with that also.
Yeah. Should we move to commercial auto?
Let's do it. Commercial
auto. And this is something you think if you have a business, you have automobiles in your business, absolutely, you should cover those. Here's a scenario though we talk about in the book. An entrepreneur sends his executive assistant to run an errand for the business. Doesn't think anything of it. She gets in a car accident. She's hurt badly. And guess what they're going to look for? Deep pockets. They come back and they say, this was a business errand sent by the business owner. So even though it was her personal car, they're going to hold you liable. And guess what? You have no coverage. So you want to make sure that not only do you have your autos, but you also have not only hired but non-owned auto protection. So even if it's an auto that you don't own, if it's something that was done by an employee at your request, you have protection there.
Yeah, and one thing that you talk about finding deep pockets, not the exact example, but one of our entrepreneur clients had his assistant driving his car. She rear ends a guy. Not a big deal. Small claim, repair the car. 9 months later, he files a lawsuit and says he lost his job because of crippling back pain. That was the product of that rear end fender bender. And now he tried to open up a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. This client had a $10 million umbrella, and he ended up suing, or they ended up settling for, I think it was $30,000 or $40,000. But the speculation is this entrepreneur was one of the owners of a 9-figure business that was all over social media. So they look at the title of the car, who owns this car? Oh, it's not her we want, it's him we want because she was driving his car. And then they piece together a story, a sob story. And again, they didn't have a whole lot of success with it, but it just shows of they're looking for the deep pockets and then going for where they think they can find some money.
Yeah. I don't have a lot of respect for people who do that, but there are people out there that do that.
Let's talk through the commercial umbrella. So one of the biggest misconceptions is that a commercial umbrella or a business umbrella goes on top of all of your policies. That's not true. The commercial umbrella will go on top of your general liability, your completed operations, and your product liability, but it will not go on top of your professional, your E&O liability, your employment practices, your cyber, your D&O. All of those are individual policies, and your umbrella does not cover all of that. So it's a little bit different than the personal umbrella that does go on top of your home and your auto, but it's a very common misconception is they think, oh, I got an umbrella. So even if I only have $500,000 of employment practices, I've got a $5 million commercial umbrella. It's going to be on top of that. No, it's a completely separate policy. And you have to read what does the commercial umbrella actually go on top of. And generally it's more of the slip and fall, completed operations, product stuff, not the rest.
Yeah, that's a good point. A lot of people don't know that. Should we move on to life insurance?
Yeah, so we talked about insurance in terms of the castle walls of protecting the assets you've accumulated. Life insurance, we also fit into this insurance bucket because it's protecting the income that the business can generate. So not just the intrinsic value of the balance sheet and the assets, but now this is protecting the income. So I know you love life insurance agents. So maybe talk all of us through buying life insurance like a billionaire.
The first thing I would say is the number one decision about life insurance and probably the most useful benefit to life insurance is the death benefit. You got to get the death benefit right, because if the death benefit is needed to replace income or for other reasons for your family or for your business, the death benefit has to be done right. What I see sometimes is insurance agents will try to get as much in a permanent policy as possible because they make more money on a permanent policy. So they kind of find out what premium the entrepreneur can afford, and then they build that around mostly permanent insurance. I would say what you need to do is find out how much death benefit you need, because you want to make sure that you're not spending so much on insurance premiums that you're not actually funding all the areas of growth for your future. And one way you can do that is buying too much permanent life insurance. So I start with the death benefit number one, and then you can see, does permanent life insurance fit in, if at all? Because sometimes it doesn't fit into your game plan and what you're trying to achieve. So term insurance for the death benefit, and then you could have a portfolio of insurance if you need a permanent policy. And I know when we created the business together, we did a buy-sell, so that if I got hit by a truck, that there'd be a death benefit that get paid, so you could buy out Mimi, so you could continue to have the business, and vice versa. If something happened to you, I got to replace you. You're pretty smart, smarter than you are good looking, but important for the business. So I want to have a death benefit so that I can buy out Leanne and also, have money to replace you. You don't have to replace me as much because I'm getting old. But those are really important pieces. And remember, we staggered it. So in so many years, we figured we would have enough assets within the business so that we could buy each other out. So we staggered it and layered that term insurance. So that's the most important thing. You want me to talk a little bit about permanent insurance?
Yeah, no, I think this is an important topic to go into. And one thing that I'll add before you talk through buying life insurance like a billionaire is you talked about why would the insurance agent solve for how much in premiums you can pay as an entrepreneur. It's because that's the direct correlation that's going to drive their commission schedule. So the more in premiums you pay, the more money that life insurance makes. It's literally a sum zero game because when it comes to permanent life insurance, generally, if they are not blending their commissions out of the policy, 100% or so of that entire first year premium ends up in the insurance agent's pocket. So he's incentivized or she's incentivized to figure out how much can you afford. That's how much I'm going to feed you instead of what is the actual goal we're trying to achieve.
Yeah. It reminds me of the old story of the guy that goes to the car lot and he has only $3,000 and surprise, there's a car that costs exactly $3,000, the money that he has. Let's talk about buying life insurance as a billionaire. And everything that we teach entrepreneurs and everything we do in our fractional family office is tied to what billionaires do. So billionaires buy retail, traditional life insurance. They also buy PPLI that we can talk about another time, but they don't buy retail life insurance the way most entrepreneurs do. Because what most entrepreneurs do is they have an insurance agent they know and like, or someone refers them to an insurance agent, and that person comes and shows a proposal that is never true. By the way, in 30 years, I've never seen a life insurance proposal come true. They're always different the way they actually play out. It looks great, and then they get their blood work, their EKG, whatever they need to do, send it up to the insurance company, get their rating, whatever that is, hopefully preferred or preferred plus, and then they put it into force, and then they have this permanent policy. That's not the way billionaires do it. What billionaires do is they always have someone who represents them, who knows the life insurance as well as the agent who's selling the life insurance, but doesn't benefit in any way whether the billionaire buys the policy or not. And that's a role that we serve for our clients, representing the entrepreneur when they're buying life insurance. Next thing is figuring out the proper type of insurance and how much we should be putting toward that. If you're building up accumulation value in a permanent policy, how much of their disposable investments should go towards something like that? And those are calculations about different tax brackets, situations, how they feel about things. There's a variety of things. There are other investments, where their money's going, what their age is. Once we've calculated all that, then the next thing is underwriting. And when it comes to underwriting, agents like to underwrite with one or two companies. First of all, they get trips and better compensation. Also, it's easier for them just to write through one company, but that's not what billionaires do. What billionaires do is they take a John Doe or a Jane Doe. They get all the medical information. They run the blood tests, the EKGs. They get all that information. They send it up with a Jane Doe or John Doe name on it, and they send it to, let's say, 10 or 15 of the top insurance companies. They let them underwrite it with the real numbers without the real person, and then they look at the offers. And then they go back and say, hey, Prudential, MetLife's got a better offer than you. Will you come up and meet the offer? So they get them negotiating against themselves, against each other. And that creates a better underwriting result. The underwriting result stays with the policy for life, forever. And just a couple of differences in an underwriting level can make hundreds of thousands of dollars of difference of cash value in the future, reduce costs and more cash value buildup. So that's the first thing. And they also require that all commissions are disclosed and negotiated. Many entrepreneurs don't know that you can actually negotiate down permanent life insurance commissions. And I've had agents tell me before, like, Jim, you can't do that. And I said, well, maybe you can't do that. But there are agents out there that can do that and will do that. And that's an expectation. So those are some of the things that you need to do if you want to buy life insurance like a billionaire.
Yeah, no, well said. This is, again, oversold solution to the entrepreneurs that we work with because they are high income, high cash flowing entrepreneurs. So they are the perfect whale for a life insurance agent to sell a overfunded life insurance policy to. So definitely very important. Let's wrap up with disability insurance. This, I would say, is one of the most overlooked insurances that far too many entrepreneurs do not have disability insurance. And if you are a sole provider and if your business cannot continue on, if you're disabled, it's actually worse than dying, because if you die, at least your death benefit gets paid out, your term insurance, whatever gets paid out to your surviving spouse and your family, they're taken care of. In a disability scenario, not only can your income potentially fall or completely disappear if the business cannot run on its own, so your family loses income, but also your expenses may go up because now you need to have all of the medical care. You may need to make sure that your house is accessible in other ways that it wasn't. So the disability scenario is actually quite scary, but very, very few entrepreneurs have any desire to get disability insurance.
And one thing, just to tie this back to the home and auto insurance, having underinsured and uninsured motorist coverage is critical, because if you do get hurt and you have a disability or you need a lot of rehab, a lot of those expenses can be covered if you have underinsured, uninsured. And there are a lot of people out there who don't have coverage, and you wouldn't be protected.
Well, I think that depends on how did you become disabled? That's where it becomes very important. Because if I'm just skiing down the mountain and I hit a tree, that's on me. There's no uninsured and underinsured that's going to get me. But if I'm walking my dog at night and someone goes off the road and hits me and they only have $50,000 of insurance, that's where the underinsured, uninsured comes into play on my policy, because then now my insurance company will step in and pay me. So I totally agree that those underinsured and uninsured is kind of like a backdoor disability policy to an extent, but it all then comes to the definition and like what's the triggering event that got you disabled. If you're responsible for the reason why you're disabled, then you need the disability policy. Whereas if it's not necessarily your fault, you're a victim, that's oftentimes where that uninsured, underinsured comes into play.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And if it looked like I was saying don't get disability insurance because you have underinsured, uninsured, I was saying that incorrectly. Make sure you have underinsured, uninsured motorist coverage on your policies. But as Bryce said, make sure that you have disability insurance if you were to get disabled and couldn't work, if there's no way your business runs or you don't have enough assets or cash flow to handle it. And this is probably one of the insurance policies that especially nobody likes. I don't like disability insurance because you're thinking, I'm not going to get disabled. There's no way I'm going to get disabled. And that's a natural thing because we just don't think it's going to happen to us. But if it happens to you and you don't have this coverage, it can destroy your family in multiple ways, but mostly or most importantly, just financially. And then that will cause other problems. But these policies are generally expensive because if someone gets disabled at age 30, they pay out to age 65 sometimes. Sometimes you do a shorter pay policy. And just make sure you're realistic about what you need. You don't want to be overinsured, but usually business owners are underinsured when it comes to disability insurance. At least that's what I see.
Yeah, I mean, and the reason they're expensive, though, is because of the underwriting and based off of the payouts. And it's just a fact that the disability insurance pays out more than life insurance. That's because there's a much higher probability of you becoming disabled than dying very early and prematurely. Yeah. So insurance pricing is 100% based off of the payout ratios and the underwriting. So that's why it's more expensive, because the probability of it happening is way more, which could lead you to saying, well, that's probably why you do need the disability insurance.
Yeah, and there could be a piece of fraud in there because you can fake being disabled. It's hard to fake being dead.
That's true.
I've seen our dog try it, and it does not work. I figure it out.
All right, so we talked about the moat from our castle. We just went through the insurance, which is going to be the castle walls. Now let's talk about the drawbridge. So the drawbridge is going to be the metaphor of entity design, making sure you have a clean entity design, protecting the corporate veil, ensures that no intruders can come barging in through the drawbridge. So what should entrepreneurs be thinking about when it comes to the drawbridge and creating a proper entity structure and design?
Yeah, well, one thing is entities will isolate the risk to what's in that particular entity. So if you think, an easy one to think about is real estate. If you own 10 properties and they're in one LLC, if there's a problem on one property, you can get sued for all 10. Now, do you need 10 LLCs? It depends on the complexity and the value of each of those properties. Maybe not. Maybe you need 3 LLCs and you put 3 in a couple and 4 in one. That's where you don't want to overcomplicate your life, but you definitely don't want all your real estate at risk if there's a problem. Within the business, are there reasons to have different entities for different businesses? Sometimes there is, sometimes there's not, but those entities can protect. And then they also protect from your personal assets. So if you're running a business, whether it's an LLC, S Corp, C Corp, and there's a problem and that business gets sued, then they're not going to be able to get out to get to your personal assets unless you're not taking care of the proper documentation to make sure that they can't do that.
Yep. And that documentation is clean books and records, treating the business as its own entity, following the operating agreement, or if it's a C corporation, the bylaws, making sure, again, that you treat it as a third party, its own bank account. All of that stuff's very clean, because if it's all commingled, if there is no clear bifurcation between the business and the personal, that's where piercing the corporate veil is very, it could open you up. And what that means is that when someone sues you, they can name not only the business, but also you. And if a judge does not think that corporate veil should be preserved, they'll pierce it, which then means you personally are exposed to all of the liability from that lawsuit, which is worst case scenario.
Yeah, and there's things you need to do every year depending on the state that you're registered. There's also things that you need to do with keeping up with the bylaws and the organizational documents and the governing documents and notes for annual meetings and stuff like that a lot of entrepreneurs don't do. And one of the obvious ones that I see happen all the time is they're moving money around between entities like those entities don't exist as a separate business entity. You have to be really, really careful about that, because if you're doing that, that's really ripe for an attorney who's suing you to pull those financial records and go, these aren't really separate entities. Money's moving around. They're just moving around as their personal piggy bank. And for that reason, Judge, you should allow us to go after the other assets.
Yep. And the other thing we'll talk through as we're talking about this piece is operating agreements and the importance of operating agreements, especially if there's multiple partners in a business. By far, the most litigation we see for our entrepreneur clients is partners suing each other, and it is by far a multitude of a factor. And so you want to make sure you have a very clean operating agreement. You want to pre-negotiate the divorce before it happens, because when you're super excited to get into business with someone, you have really good feelings, you're feeling great. Let's negotiate. What does it look like if we don't want to be partners? Can we buy the other person out? Can any of us become a passive owner without losing equity? You want to negotiate all of that and very clearly define it all within the operating agreement. So if stuff hits the fan, it's very clear. It's not open to interpretation, because whenever there's a gray area and open to interpretation, you're naturally going to interpret it completely separate ways that benefit you and not the adverse party. And then that's where we see litigation come into play.
And this can go on for years and years and costs millions and millions of dollars, and the business usually suffers.
Yep.
I've seen the businesses take huge hit while people are fighting this thing out. It's almost like prenuptial agreements, which a lot of times people are against, but it's really deciding if there's a breakup, what is the breakup going to look like? And too often, to your point, when two entrepreneurs come together and they're going to start a business, it's not because they don't think it's going to work. It's not because they don't believe in each other and like each other, and they don't think of all these things. I remember when we became business partners and we went through a lot of negotiating on what would it look like if we break up type of thing. And for the most part, because always in our relationship, in almost every situation, we haven't had any contention. There were a couple points in that agreement where we got a little contentious, if I remember. And we worked it out because we wanted to work it out. But that was really healthy, that we kind of, I wouldn't say fought over, but just negotiated over those things to make sure that, because you and I, based on what we know, we both knew, like, we've got to be serious about this. We can't just assume we're never going to have a problem. And at the exit, we both have to feel good about how we determine the exit would look like. And by the end, I think we felt good about it. I think that we both compromised in some areas. And then guess what? It never applied. We never had to worry about it. We became an ESOP, sold to our employees. However, we did the smart thing and went through paragraph by paragraph and made sure that each of us could live with it. And we each gave a little bit. I mean, wouldn't you say that's true?
Yeah, 100%. I think the biggest thing too is that by going through that process, you kind of game theory out in your head. If this happens, here's how this plays out. So then therefore, if it does happen and you're in that situation in the future, you know how it's going to play out because you went through the entire process. So like you said, luckily we never did. But I think that's the most valuable thing is it's like you're going through the motions and you can kind of see, okay, if this happens, then this happens. So then that way, again, it just sets expectations because that's where you want to minimize the gap between expectations and reality. That's what that process does.
Yeah, and we were super detailed. I remember there were a couple of times where we went back and just said, okay, what about this? That doesn't work for you. What about this? And we just kind of went back and forth and figured out how it would work. And I rarely know entrepreneurs that start businesses together. And of course, we didn't start a business together, but who go into partnership together, who spend the time really looking at it and taking it seriously. And we did that. I'm proud we did that. And I'm glad. It was actually a good exercise to see how we could work through things if we disagreed on stuff in the future.
Yep. 100%. Okay, so that's going to be the drawbridge there. Keeping your books and records clean, separate, operating agreements, bylaws. Don't allow a creditor or a predator to ever pierce the corporate veil. Just in case someone does get in, they get over the moat, they breach the walls, they go into the drawbridge. The last layer of protection we've got is the hidden vaults. And this is going to be asset protection trust. And so this is going to be someone's pierced through the business. They're now coming after everything that I personally own that is subject to claims. So then this is where the domestic asset protection trust, the foreign asset protection trust come into play, and then contrasting that versus a revocable trust. So I think the way to maybe frame this up, Jim, is just to discuss at a super, super high level what a revocable trust is, because oftentimes entrepreneurs think, oh, I got a revocable trust, I got a creditor protection. Not the case. And then layer that up to adapt, layer that up to what we're calling a FAPT, which are foreign asset protection trusts, so we can kind of see the stacking of the creditor protection.
Right. So a revocable trust, which most everybody listening to this podcast needs, it's really to avoid probate when someone dies. It's also for change of control. So if someone gets disabled, we just talked about being disabled, someone can step in as a trustee. So if you have a power of attorney is not protected by states. Often banks have their own power of attorney that you've got to fill out. And if you try to use one from your attorney and someone's already disabled, they won't let you use it. So change of control. Trustee is protected in every state. You can step into the shoes of the other person. So all the assets in the revocable trust would be protected for change of control, disability, and death to avoid probate and to keep private. Now, you can have your revocable trust set up so that it becomes an irrevocable trust when someone passes away, and then you have creditor protection at that point. But while you're alive, your revocable trust does not have any asset protection. So that is a misunderstanding. And to tie back to the insurance, make sure that you list your revocable trust as an additional insured on your home and auto policy. Often that's not listed, and a lot of your personal assets are in your revocable trust. So don't confuse the revocable trust with something that actually has asset protection. As far as tax savings, it can have some tax savings using your exclusion, keeping your exclusion, that $15 million from estate taxes, which estate taxes start above $15 million per person at a 40% bracket. So it does have that type of tax savings. Otherwise, there's no tax savings in your revocable trust and no asset protection. But beyond that, you can move to more advanced structures. Why don't you go into the more advanced structures that are irrevocable?
Yeah, so the first common one is a domestic asset protection trust. So these are not allowed in every single state. They're called a self-settled asset protection trust, meaning that you as the entrepreneur can put your own money, your own assets into this trust. You can be the investment trustee, which means you have control in terms of where is that money going to be invested and deployed. You can be a beneficiary, which means you can receive distributions from the trust. The only wrinkle is you need a third-party distribution trustee. So you need a third party that's arm's length to be the one who interprets the trust document, and they only push money out to you at based off what the document says. That's exactly where the creditor protection comes into play, because if you say, well, I don't own any assets, so if you sue me, I don't own anything. This trust owns all of these different assets, but I'm not the owner of this trust. So yes, I'm a beneficiary. So then even if someone had a judgment or they were to then go after the trust, the distribution trustee says, well, shoot, I don't see your name on my beneficiary list. Therefore, I'm not going to push money out to you. So that's how these assets are solidified within these asset protection trust structures. Now, even if you don't live in one of these states, there's around 21 states of where these are legal today. Nevada, South Dakota being two of the most popular. Tennessee's up and coming. But even if you don't live in one of these states, you can hire a distribution trustee in that state. So then therefore that creates situs in that state, so you can still take advantage of that state's trust law. So we see that very frequently with entrepreneurs who don't live in a DAPT state. DAPT stands for Domestic Asset Protection Trust. Just hire that local trustee, and you can do it for as cheap as maybe $5,000 a year to get that independent distribution trustee.
Yeah, one thing that I've heard from some very smart attorneys as well, the domestic asset protection self-settling trusts have not been proven out in the courts. And the reason why is because usually people settle. So it looks, I like to say, you want your assets not to look like a rabbit, but to look like a porcupine if the wolf comes trying to eat you. And DAPs definitely look like a porcupine. So even though they don't have a ton of case law, because they've been around for, 20 or 30 years, something like that, it's still a great structure and will add asset protection, because usually people don't want to try to go get a court to overturn or to pierce this trust. It's very difficult. And then you got the problem of the distribution trustee who, without a court order from a judge is not going to distribute the money anywhere. So we've seen these work very well for entrepreneurs.
Yep. And then if you want to go even a step further, that's where you go offshore. So a foreign asset protection trust is oftentimes going to be in like the Cook Islands, Belize, Nevis, somewhere like that, which just means that the trustee is going to be located there. So if there is some sort of judgment derived to the United States, the creditor needs to go to that physical location, and those locations don't play nicely with any judgments passed down from the United States. So they kind of just tell you go pound sand. So they work to a further, I'd say a better extent than a domestic asset protection trust, just because there's more barriers. It's more of a porcupine, as you'd say, but it doesn't come without a cost. Those foreign asset protection trusts are extremely expensive because if you think about it, they're very specialized in the creation of those. So they cost tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars of upfront fees. And on top of that, now the accounting cost is crazy. You have FBAR, you have FATCA, you have a lot of disclosures you need to submit to the IRS. So the annual tax costs and compliance costs is generally $25,000 a year. Then you have the trustee costs, and then getting your money out of the trust is also takes a little bit more effort, and it needs to be invested from an investment trustee who's normally located in that location. So normally you're going to slap a new cost of investment management fees or another layer of investment management fees. So the Foreign Asset Protection Trust does take the Domestic Asset Protection Trust to the next level, but transparently with, like you said, DAPs have held up pretty darn well that oftentimes the added cost and complexity isn't worth the incremental asset protection in our experience.
You have to have enough assets to where you would want to do that and enough concern about what liabilities that you actually face based on your lifestyle, your family, your situation. I will say that using foreign trust for asset protection is very strong. However, like you said, it adds a lot of complexity and cost. Do not use foreign trust to evade income taxes. The IRS frowns, I'd say, to say the least, frowns on people trying to move money offshore to avoid U.S. taxes. So I would tell you, I recommend that you don't do that. That falls into the tax evasion rather than the tax avoidance category, and I would steer clear of that if you are listening.
Awesome. All right. So we went through this. We have an ILA asset protection framework tool that anyone who picks up the book can scan the QR code or go to the URL and pick that up. But again, when we're thinking of asset protection, think of your business, think of your wealth. You want to keep it protected from the castle. Build the moat, take advantage of all the laws and regulations avoided to you or provided to you in the state and in the United States. Then you want to make sure you have the right insurance in place, both personal, commercial, life, disability insurance. That's your castle wall. The drawbridge is your entity design, your corporate structure, the bylaws, the operating agreement. And then worst case scenario, if they penetrate everything, that's where the asset protection trusts come into play. Those are your hidden vaults. So that's the framework and how you should think about asset protection as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, I think that's pretty comprehensive. And within all of these areas, remember, we're scratching the surface. There's a lot deeper things that you can do. However, having a good framework and a good overall plan in all these areas will get you miles ahead as far as asset protection.
All right, Jim, that does chapter 3 of our book club. Well, I'm going to see you back here. We're going to go into wealth transfer and pick up where we left off with chapter 4.
I like it.
Thanks for listening to the Make Rich Real podcast, where million-dollar businesses meet billionaire strategies. Please note the following disclosure. This podcast is provided by Do Wealth Management, an SEC-registered investment advisor. Registration with the SEC does not imply a certain level of skill or training. The information presented in this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only and should not be construed as personalized investment advice, tax advice, or legal advice, or a recommendation to buy or sell any security. Nothing discussed in this podcast constitutes a solicitation or offer to provide investment advisory services to any person in any jurisdiction where such solicitation or offer would be unlawful under the securities law of such jurisdiction. All information presented is believed to be reliable, but is not guaranteed for accuracy or completeness. All investing involves risk, including the potential loss of principal. Past performance, if mentioned, is not indicative of future results, and no investment strategy can guarantee profit or loss. Any mention of specific securities, investment strategies, or market performance is for illustrative purposes only and should not be considered a recommendation. Economic and market conditions are subject to change, and any opinions expressed are currently only as of the date of this recording. Before making any investment decisions, please consult with a qualified financial professional who can assess your individual circumstances, risk tolerance, and investment objectives. For more information about our services and fees, please refer to our ADV Part 2A, which is available at our website, dowealth.com, or upon request.